On behalf of the Bahá'í Chair for Studies in Development at Devi Ahilya Vishwavidyalaya, I would like to invite um, all our participants who have joined today, and to especially welcome our speaker for today, Dr. Vasant Saberwal, who is the director of the Center for Pastoralism. Dr. Saberwal is going to speak to us on an issue of vital importance for the prospects of development of our nation, given the percentage of the population that is affected by the issue. He is going to speak on the theme of Himalayan pastoralism, glory days, last gasp, somewhere in between. I will let Dr. Saberwal, go into the subject, and I won't take time the beginning with an introduction to the theme. I will let him do that. But I think before we start, a few words about our speaker is in order. Vasant is the director of the Center for Pastoralism. His research interests have lain at the intersection of the politics of science and its use in shaping the terms of access to grazing, forest, and water resources. He has worked on pastoral communities of the Himalaya for well over 3 decades. He did a PhD in political ecology with a focus on Himachali pastoralism and postdoctoral research in the Western Ghats. His publications include Pastoral Politics, Shepherds, Bureaucrats, and Conservation in the Western Himalaya, Battles over Nature, Science, and the Politics of Wildlife Conservation, which he edited with Mahesh Rangarajan, and with Ashwini Chhatre, Democratizing Nature, Politics, Conservation, and Development in India. His films, co-directed with Sanjay Barnela, include the award-winning documentaries River Taming Mantras and Hunting Down Water, part of a 5-part series on the political economy of water. Friends, without taking more time, I would like to welcome Vasant, if I may call you by your first name, to share his comments. Just a few comments, housekeeping points before we start. The lecture will be for around 40 to 45 minutes, after which we will have time for all our participants joining on Facebook as well as on Zoom to share their questions and comments with the speaker. Please make note of your comments and questions and post them in the Q&A box, which will be where the comments and the questions will be taken to ask Vasant. So over to you, Vasant.
Thank you, Arash. I did want to say that I've seen the lineup of far more illustrious people who've spoken on this forum, and I'm deeply honored to be asked to be here. What I thought I'd do is give you an overview of pastoralism in Himachal Pradesh, and sort of try and get at the kinds of transitions that we are beginning to see. Because Himalayan pastoralism as a whole tends to be informed by similar sorts of sort of the impetus is similar across the Western Himalaya in particular. The argument that I'm putting forward, I believe, holds across this landscape, but the details that I'm using pertain particularly to Himachal Pradesh. where I did research back in the district of Kangra in the 90s, in the district of Kullu, the neighboring district of Kullu in the 2000s. And then subsequently, I've had occasion to visit pastoral communities in Kangra on a number of occasions. But more recently, colleagues of mine at the Center for Pastoralism, particularly Anirudh Sheth, who leads our research, and Vidur Dutt, who is a researcher, they've been doing a number of surveys. And so what I'm in a position to do, fortunately, is to look at data from the 90s and compare some of that with our more recent data. But I'm going to start with the issue of why work on pastoralism, right? And when people ask, what do you do, where do you work, and so on, I say the Center of Pastoralism, and the assumption is that it must have something to do with the church, since there is a pastor. When I talk of the flocks of sheep, it serves to reinforce the idea that there must be a pastor with his or her flock of humans that they're sort of ministering. But the fact remains that even when people understand that this is work relating to the mobile management of animals, it still raises the question, but surely the time for such livelihoods, the time for such a lifestyle has elapsed. When you think of the ways in which we describe the evolution of human societies, you think of hunter-gatherers who are mobile. They then begin to domesticate animals. They're still mobile. They eventually settle as cultivators. And that then goes into the industrial society and a technological society and so on. But very clearly, there is a civilizational graph. There's an assumption that you evolve into more settled and therefore more civilized ways of living. And if you are settled, then it's easier to access services. It's easier for the government to provide services. And this deeply philosophical sort of position that a settled community is a more advanced form of social organization. It has its roots in 16th, 17th century philosophy and informed the British, the colonial states thinking about settling communities, as well as the post-colonial states attempt to settle communities. And yet, 200 years later, you still have communities practicing pastoralism across the country. And I'm now just going to dive into the presentation. I'm going to hope that I have the capacity to share the screen. And so you, despite this resistance, this pressure to settle, hostility, the absence of support, you still have pastoralism that sustains in perhaps 17 states in the country, 2 union territories. There are very large numbers of animals that they manage, sheep, goats, all camel populations. They don't manage all goats in the country. India's goat population is actually 150 million or thereabouts, but about half of them are managed by pastoralists. So all in all, if you look at the buffalo and cattle population, about 10% of buffalo and cattle population are managed by pastoralists. So they're very, very large numbers. And if you think of their contributions, we assume that they contribute about 70% of India's meat economy comes from them. 10 to 15% of the dairy industry is dependent on them. Agricultural communities, particularly in the Deccan and in Western India, pay pastoral communities to pen their animals on their fields. We are not entirely clear of the ecological implications of that, but it is contributing to food security through this pathway. 44% of all domesticated animal species have been developed and continue to be managed by pastoral communities. If you think of the value of the assets managed by pastoral communities, that our most current estimates suggest about $45 billion. That generates revenues in the range of $11 billion. We think this could go to 16, and that would represent about 3% of agricultural GDP. So these are large numbers. The reason we are doing some of this economic analysis is precisely because pastoral communities and their livestock tend to go under the radar. And as a result, because the state has never managed to enumerate either pastoralists or their livestock, you don't have a sense of their contributions to the economy or to food security and so on. And because they go under the radar, there is no focus on these communities. And by trying to quantify these numbers, we are hoping that policymakers, the state, and so on, will recognize that this is a sector that is deserving of greater attention. In addition to the economic contributions, they graze maybe 10, 11% of the landscape. The biological diversity, the wild fauna and flora in this landscape has been shaped by 200 years or 300 or 400 years of being grazed. It is a unique assemblage of fauna and flora. Where we have had instances where this kind of grazing has stopped, the diversity, the landscape itself closes in, it becomes less diverse. And very recent sort of research is making the point that carbon sequestration, the amount of carbon that is sequestered below the ground in grazed grasslands is higher than the carbon that is sequestered above ground in forested landscapes, particularly in arid and semi-arid landscapes that are water deprived. So from both an economic and an ecological standpoint, the assumption is that they make very substantial contributions. And on the flip side, should there be a settling of these communities, we assume it would lead to reduced genetic diversity. It would lead to substantially higher levels of financial insecurity. We have research that establishes that households that continue to practice pastoralism are more financially secure than households within the same area that are no longer practicing pastoralism. And I'll get to some of that household level data. There are implications for India's open systems, and there is contributions to GDP that would be that would be substantially impacted. Okay, I'm now going to walk you through the logic of pastoralism in the Himalayas. And the first thing that is sort of critical to understanding is that in Himalayan landscapes, you tend to get maybe 11 to 12% of the land is cultivable. And so you end up with the remainder of the land, which is either forest, rangeland, or rock or ice. But the forest and rangelands are amenable, are sort of the optimal use of these lands from a livelihood perspective is animal husbandry, and which is why across the Western Himalayas, to a lesser extent in the Eastern Himalayas, but across the Western Himalayas, you have this preponderance of pastoralism as a form of livelihood. One of the things you hear about within the mainstream is that pastoralism occurs on very marginal landscapes. They tend to inhabit marginal geographies, but also they are present sort of in socially marginal spaces. And sort of that sort of underlies the idea that there's that they will settle eventually. There's a limited need to engage with them and so on. CFP, the Center for Pastoralism, apart from the economic research, we've been mapping pastoral routes. And this is an example of Himachal Pradesh. And you can see that pretty much the entire state of Himachal Pradesh is grazed by pastoralists at some point or the other through the year. These are seasonal uses, and I'll get to that seasonality, but you can see that the entire state does get used. Much the same holds for Uttarakhand. We're still looking, we haven't got all the data that we need, but the broad pattern holds that all parts, both in the north and the south, all parts get used at some point or another. In all mountain landscapes, whether it's in India or outside India, what you see is a elevational gradient. So you get pastoral communities who will spend the summer in what are called alpine meadows at high altitude. These areas will get covered in snow by November. So by September or October, they descend and come down to the low-lying foothills. And then they'll reverse that in March or April, they'll go back up. And in accessing these meadows at high altitude is the cornerstone of mountain-based transhumance of this kind, because of the fact that the growing season is a 6 or 7 month growing season. You get this concentrated flush of nitrogen during that 6 or 7 month period. And as a result, it leads to dramatically productive herds, which are dramatically productive because they have access to this level of nutrition. So that's one aspect to keep in mind in terms of the seasonality, and I'll walk you through the other. But in the summer, if you look at this landscape, there are no roads, there's no industry, there's no cultivation, there's no habitation. There are no other claimants to this land. You have to understand that getting up here it'll take you 4 or 5 days to get up to this point, walking along sometimes dangerous paths and so on. So nobody really, other than wildlife conservationists, nobody has an interest or has a claim to these landscapes. And when you contrast that with the winter areas, there are roads, there's cultivation, there is the forest department that is planting trees. And so it is a environment within which there is a greater competition for much scarcer resources. So it's a more difficult space within which to obtain access to the forage that you need. And on the right, the bottom right, is a picture of a cultivating community alongside a pastoral community. And back in the 90s, this is a picture from the 90s, pastoralists were invited into this landscape because you tended to get a single crop during the course of the year. And so you had their cultivation, their lands, the cultivated lands were fallow for 5-6 months of the year. Certainly after the kharif crop had been harvested, they'd be fallow. You'd invite pastoralists to come in. They would pen the animals over here on the fields, as you can see in the top right corner. They would often be paid to bring the animals, both to clear the stubble, but also to fertilize the lands. There would be quite close kinship networks. There's a term called Bahá'í, and a daughter of a cultivating community would tie a rakhi on a pastoralist family who would come down. There'd be a bhaitu, a similar sort of arrangement where a brother would sort of have would adopt a sister from the other community, and these were taken very seriously. There was expectation of being present during Rakhi, and all the ritual that we associate with that in a family has been a part of this. These networks, and those networks are fraying at the moment, because now you've moved to double and triple cropping in these lands as irrigation has become available, as fertilizers become available. And that's part of the story of the nature of transition that I will get into. Most of the shepherd communities in Himachal Pradesh, this is a little different from Kashmir, where you don't have this pattern, but communities in Himachal Pradesh, the herding communities, the herding villages tend to be at about mid-elevation, about 7,000 feet, 7,000 feet, where they have cultivable land. And the migration cycle is closely tied into the labor cycle associated with the cultivation of land. So when you're going up for the summer, you will come to your village in April or May, when you have to prepare the land for the kharif season. Your labor is required. You'll camp your animals just above the village. You'll come down, help prepare the fields, and then take your animals to high elevation. On the way down, you will again park your animals just above the village, help harvest the kharif crop, and then come down into the winter area. So it's a very tightly sort of interwoven. The agricultural and pastoral cycles are quite tightly interwoven. And so you end up with this map, which is the red dots represent the summer locations, the blue dots represent the winter locations, and those orange, sort of the yellow-orange dots in the middle are the locations where you have herder villages. And much the same holds for Uttarakhand. Another trope about pastoralists is the idea of the simpleton. The pastoralist is a simple nomad, and he's following his animals, and they'll sort of wander fairly aimlessly over the landscape. Nothing could be farther from the truth. You access forage, and this piece of this story is particular to Himachal. I'm not sufficiently clear on property relationships in Uttarakhand or Jammu and Kashmir. But in Himachal Pradesh, shepherds gain access to specific tracts of land in the summer called dhars, and specific tracts of land called bans in the winter. And the right to use this land is inherited from father to son. It's not land that you can sell, but you can rent out the right to use this land to other pastoralists. And what you see over here is, if you think of this landscape, if you were to walk through this landscape, there would be no signposts in the sense of a road, a village. There's nothing to signpost the village other than the fact that this is the Kalihani Valley, right? But if you look at the numbering, 1, 2, 3, and 4, these are named landscapes. It would be Gwala, Batal, Shard. These are names that everybody in the community is completely aware of. And so everybody knows that Jitram has the right to graze his animals in the number 1, which is Batal. I forget what it's called. But every individual herder has the right to a very specific tract of land. And the same thing happens in the bans in winter. So it suggests so there is a clearly regulated process by which herders get access to the winter and summer forage. And that might suggest a degree of rigidity. And that is not actually correct. And there is enormous dynamism over here, because herder numbers, the numbers of livestock managed by a herder, can change quite dramatically because of illness, because of having to sell animals for a death in the family, or because of having an exceptionally good year and the number of your animals might increase dramatically. And to accommodate these changes, the right to graze, say, Batal or Shard, herders will interchange with each other as to who grazes which piece of land as a function of that land's capacity to support a given size of herd, given number of animals. And so Batal might actually have a much smaller capacity compared to number 4, which is Shard. And so you will make arrangements to ensure that people go from, they exchange rights to graze one or the other, primarily because if you were to overstock the land, it would lead both to degradation, but it would also lead to a underperformance of your own herd, which would not have access to adequate forage, right? So inbuilt into this property system is, in fact, the logic as to why is it that pastoral communities do not necessarily degrade their land. This is not, the classic trope is one of the irrational herder who's overstocking his land. Property systems in Himachal, the ones I've studied, are clearly structured in a way to ensure that where there is where grazing pressures increase, people have the flexibility to move around into spaces that can accommodate the herding. But one last thing I wanted to mention over here is the idea of upward mobility within pastoral communities, best captured, I think, by the following. Back in the 30s, back in the 90s, if you joined a herder as labor, you would get 40 animals at the start of a 4-year contract. All animals that were born to those 40 then belong to you. So over a 4-year period, you would transition from being labor to being a mid-sized herder with assets of 100 animals. There is no other rural livelihood, especially connected to land, where labor that is working on land can actually build up an asset in land. That's not going to happen, right? And so in some ways, what is remarkable about pastoralism is, in fact, its capacity to enable this form of upward mobility within the herding community. Increasingly, there are instances where Bihari labor might come into Kinnaur as a part of Himachal and working on roads. These are people, families who've lived in flood-prone areas. They have no knowledge of snow and so on, and will become apprentices to herders and eventually get into a situation where they own 100 animals. So they become mid-sized herders, a process that is unique, I think, to pastoralism. I wanted to walk you through the whole logic of why is it that there is the degree of hostility that pastoralists continue to face today. Back in the 1850s, when the Forest Department was established in the north, in Punjab, initially the demands on the Forest Department were to grow timber. And the Forest Department quickly recognized that the presence of goats and sheep and cows and buffaloes was inimical. You could not both grow trees and grow goats on the same piece of land. They would simply chew up all the seedlings, all the saplings. And so that was the initial resistance, the opposition to forest to herding. This transitions by the 1910s and 20s to the expectation that grazing pressures would lead to soil erosion and to a worsening of the hydrological cycle, that you would then have alternating floods and droughts because of a reduced capacity on the part of the land to absorb water. At its extreme, the imagery was one of soil eroded from Himachal's sort of hills and mountains being carried into the Bay of Bengal and forming islands in the Bay of Bengal. That was the imagery used by the Forest Department in its attempts to get regulations passed with regard to pastoralists. And this use of imagery, this use of this narrative about the irrational herder overstocking his land, it's a global phenomenon. So you see the same thing with regard to the Saharan desert creeping southward. This was entirely because of irrational pastoralists. The idea of the Thar desert expanding eastward into Delhi was because of irrational pastoralists. The idea of mountain ecosystems being eroded was because of either overstocking of animals or irrational use by cultivators. And all of this is premised on quite clever use of imagery. So in the Saharan desert, for example, if you took an image during the monsoon, it's nice and lush. And if you take it in the dry season or at the end of an extended drought period of 3 or 4 years, it is a lunar landscape, right? But if you come back 2 years later after a heavy rainfall, it has recovered completely. So in order to advance your argument that there's a need to move people off the land, there was this alarmist imagery that the Indian Forest Department, which was largely German at the time, or trained by German foresters, we either contributed to or borrowed from much of the language of the time. And then eventually in the 70s, it's about wildlife conservation. In the 90s, it's about biodiversity conservation. Today, it's about how pastoralism is responsible for reducing carbon sequestration. So there is a global process by which we have adopted terminology from a global discourse in our efforts to reduce grazing pressures on the land. I'm going to skip through this. I'm a little short on time, so I'm going to skip through this. This is essentially to make the point that in this sort of 150, 200-year arc of criticism, there's an absence of data. And the fieldwork I was doing in the 90s focused very squarely on trying to identify what is the basis on which we are saying there's higher rates of soil erosion or a worsening of the hydrological cycle. Where's the data on that? And there is no data. There is an intuitiveness to the way in which the Forest Department is able to advance its arguments. It's something that I think all of us buy into, frankly. Many of us in this room will with quite a great deal of freedom say that goats are responsible for degradation. It's a very complicated story. And some of these pictures I would have used to explain that both with regard to snow leopard conservation, but also alpine meadow conservation, it doesn't it doesn't hold water. There's a lot of evidence that's now countering this assumption. Similarly, this is again the use of imagery. If you have a close-up of a fire in alpine areas, it looks terrible on the left. If you pull back that camera on the right, it's a small fire. But I was with conservationist friends who saw this fire, and they said, you know, this is irresponsible, and pastoralists should not be allowed here because they burn the landscape. There's a perfectly good reason for doing that, but it looks bad, and therefore it lends itself to that kind of imagery. There is clearly declining interest in pastoralism. There is an aspiration. A younger generation is not that keen on spending, being up in the wilderness for 24 hours a day. It's raining, it's cold, it's hot, whatever it is, you have no option but being up there. There was the beginnings of this aspirational shift in the 90s. I think that's much more in evidence today, for obvious reasons. We live in a much more visibly materialistic world. Like any other community, young men are interested in partaking of that culture. Education in the 90s in the village I worked in, the first boy graduated from class 12. Every boy, girl graduates from class 12 today. And in a sort of recent encounter, somebody said, "मैं बर्तन मंजवा लूंगा अपने लड़के से, लेकिन ये काम नहीं करवाऊंगा." He can suffer the indignity of washing dishes in a restaurant, but he won't do this because of the way in which society and the forest department look down. There's a pejorative way in which you treat communities. But more to sort of from a data standpoint, there are very few younger men in herder camps. There are fewer households in the village of Bada Bengal. They've gone from 20 to 10. Wintering areas are less welcome, as I said. And the terms of labor have changed from the earlier sense that you'd work for 4 years and you'd get 40 animals. You had a stake in pastoralism. Today, the sense is, I'd rather get a monthly or a seasonal wage. It offers me greater flexibility in terms of how I spend that money, where I choose to work, on what, and I just don't have the same sort of stake in that. I think that sort of transition in the terms of labor working with pastoralists is the clearest indication that there is a lower stake in pastoralism all over. So then the question is pastoralism on the decline? And this is data that that colleagues have generated. And what the data is saying is that historically, 53 households in this particular sampling of 16 villages in the Kulu Valley, 53 households did not have herds. 99 of them today do not have herds. In the category of 1 to 20 animals, 38 households had only 1 to 20 animals historically. That number has tripled. It's about the same for households having between 21 and 50 animals. But the big change is in the fact that far fewer households have large herds, about 51. There's a third of the households between 51 and 100, and very few households have over 100 animals. There's also a clear halving of the total number of animals in this valley in Kulu. And so the transition that we are seeing is not a desire to completely give up pastoralism. The fact that you have many more households retaining a toehold in pastoralism, having between 20 and 50 animals, our analysis is that it is a function of the highly lucrative nature of pastoralism. Back in the 90s, an animal sold for 500 rupees. Today, it sells for between 10 and 12,000 rupees. If you factor in inflation, it would come to 6,000 or 7,000. So there is a way in which the value of goats and sheep has outpaced inflation. It is too big an opportunity for revenue generation for households to completely give up. So because they do not have access to the labor, their children are no longer interested, because there is very substantial needs for labor to manage herds in the winter areas, they have done two things. They have reduced the numbers of animals they'll keep, and they have stopped going all the way down into the winter areas. Instead, because they have only 20 animals, they can manage those animals at home. If they had 200 animals, they had to send them down into the winter areas. So the transition is one of localized grazing with much smaller herds, but enabling them crucially to take advantage of the alpine pastures, which are these very, very nutritious pastures. And you see a similar transition within Uttarakhand, that the bulk of the pastoralists who are still operational, and they're quite large numbers, they take the animals to alpine pastures and come down. They will often aggregate the animals into a single herd, but then the animals come down in September, October, and disperse to their individual households. There are other forms of transition taking place amongst buffalo herding communities. I won't go down into that, but this pattern seems to hold between Uttarakhand and Himachal. I'm going to skip this, but I will talk a little about policy implications for these communities. One, there is a need for much better data. We do not have a sense of the number of pastoralists. We really don't have a sense of the number of livestock managed by pastoral communities. Our sense is that both figures would be larger than is assumed, and that especially where there is an acceptance of the size of the contribution to the economy, to food security, to genetic diversity of our livestock, to ecosystem services. As you begin to recognize those kinds of contributions, you stop thinking of them as simpletons who are sort of mindless wandering all over the landscape. You think of them as more sophisticated communities that have substantial contributions to make. And therefore, there is a need for government and other stakeholders to engage from a policy perspective. The biggest issue is one of access to grazing. And certainly within national parks and sanctuaries, there is much declining access to these areas. There is a constant pushback, and a lot of the work we do is to use the Forest Rights Act as a means of securing such access to resources, but there is a need for a more concerted effort in that direction. There's a need for investments in infrastructure, both with regard to milk and with regard to wool. The bulk of our wool in India is today discarded because we grow our sheep produce a certain coarse variety of wool. Industrial use of wool has transitioned to merino wool, which is a smooth, long staple wool. All industry has sort of adapted to that. And that transition happened because we eliminated all tariff barriers that used to, that prevented merino wool from coming in. There was certain protection to our wool. But there is a way in which wool would be ideal for use in insulation, thermal and acoustic insulation. We're doing some prototyping on that. As well as in the packaging industry in lieu of thermocol and so on. And there's sort of a need for improved veterinary care and so on. But really the crucial issue is that if you do not have access to enough forage, that will, by definition, sound the death. That will eliminate the possibility of pastoralism. And I think in a world in which the Indian economy is growing, but much of that is jobless. For us to not focus on what is a productive, potentially lucrative means of production, a livelihood system that has substantial contributions, that is a mistake. And so our advocacy with government revolves around the need for greater support to these communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vasant, for this wonderful presentation that really helped us understand the real picture of pastoralism in India and its potential, its challenges, what the reality of this kind of work is, and the kind of misconceptions that exist. So I think we have a few questions. One is why is pastoralism only in the west of India? Um, I don't know if should we go through a few of them and then you decide.
Sure,
You want,
sure, sure.
the second question from Swaraj is, does pastoral work always need migration? How do they educate their children if they are moving all the time? So then
Okay.
there's another question by Swaraj. Where do the values that have shaped the practice of pastoralism come from? Is it from a culture that is distinct from settler society? Maybe we could take these three and then there
Sure.
probably maybe more.
So, pastoralism, the three geographies in India where you get this form of animal husbandry. One is the northwestern Himalayas. The other is the west, which would be the arid lands of Rajasthan and Gujarat, primarily Kutch, but also parts of Saurashtra. And the third is the Deccan Plateau, which is a semi-arid part of the landscape. And it would include Maharashtra, Karnataka, Telangana, parts of Andhra Pradesh, parts of Tamil Nadu. And what is characteristic of all three of these regions, you have some more pastoralism in the northeast also, but these are really the three big geographies. And what's characteristic of all of them is that you have in Western India and in Rajasthan, you have it's suboptimal from a cultivating standpoint because these are not because they're arid and semi-arid. There is a shortage of water. And in landscapes where there is a shortage of water in the west, in Western India and in the Deccan, and where there are steep slopes in the Himalayas, under both of these conditions, you do not have the option of cultivating these lands. As that is really the reason that you will get such large concentrations of pastoralism in the mountains and in the western and Deccan part of the country. It's just a really straightforward link between aridity, semi-aridity, and steepness of slope. Very interesting question about values that have shaped pastoralism and how might they differ from landed communities. You often you see pastoral communities on the move, and all of their belongings. This is not true of the Himalayas, where you do have settled housing, but a lot of times you'll find pastoralists with all of the entire belonging fits onto a couple of camels, right? And there is a sense of living lightly on the ground, on the land. And there's a lot of poetry, there's a lot of music that talks of the need to live in this fashion of the relationship between humans and animals, the relationship between animals and the land. And it certainly in this day and age, it has a feel of communities that are more closely tied to nature than, say, farming communities, who, because of 30 or 40 years of now being able to sink their own bore wells or they provide their canal irrigation, they have access, they can control the degree to which they have to respond to the vagaries of the climate. They're no longer affected in some ways. They can pump their tube well, or they can get canal irrigation as and when they need it. Or they can use chemical fertilizers so they don't really depend on somebody else. So they have a much greater control over their physical environment. And to that extent, it's likely that there is a greater disconnect between these communities and the environment. And pastoralists there is a understanding, there will be commentary on the vegetation that they're passing through, on the vegetation that their animals will enjoy, will like, of the fact that they will want both sweet and salty vegetation like any human being. So they're constantly making references to how human behavior is similar to animal behavior within the context of this environment. So I think the fact that you have a dependence on the environment transforms the way you think about it. And so to that extent, I think there is a difference from, say, a farming community of today and a pastoral community of today. Education is every pastoralist family wants to get their kids educated. There's no two ways about that. In Kashmir, there's an interesting experiment where schools, the government would support mobile schools, and they'd go up with pastoral communities and come down. There's been no other effort in the country to ensure that the education can happen alongside the movement of these communities. And so now you increasingly get women will stay back at home with the kids and educate them, and men will take the animals out. And certainly within the communities where we are seeing this transition to having 20 to 30 animals instead of 200, there is a much greater capacity to be attuned to the, say, educational cycle of your immediate vicinity. And you're not making such large traverses as you used to. There's a much greater possibility of 5 households aggregating their herds together and one person taking up the animals to the field. So everybody else can be at home, education is possible, and so on.
Thank you, Vasant. The next question is, can you explain the philosophical basis for this bias towards settlers in public policy? I think you had mentioned about in Europe about this. Do you want to answer that, or should we?
It's a complicated question. So let me just take this and we can come back to the next.
Sure.
Which is that if you think of so private property begins to be seen as the basis of a more advanced society, on the assumption that if I own my own land, I will invest of myself, of my energy, my capital, my labor. I will invest in it because it is mine. And by virtue of that investment, that land will become more productive. I will bund it, I will level it, I will ensure there's water, I will invest in it to make it more productive. And in that conceptualization, a more productive landscape makes you are also more productive because you have invested of yourself. So a more productive society is a more advanced society in that conception, right? And that has very deep philosophical roots, which leads the colonial state to invest very heavily in the Punjab. They came to be called the canal colonies, as in these, and Nilandri Bhattacharya's book, recent 2-year-old book, it talks of how this very large landscape, all pastoral, these are all pastoral communities. Gujars used to use this landscape of the Punjab, and the rivers of the Punjab were, the waters from the Punjab, the rivers in the Punjab were used, and canals were used to deliver this water into this landscape, and settlers were incentivized to settle. Pastoralists were incentivized to settle here to make the landscape more productive, right? And that served 2 purposes. It was you taxed it, and so you got more revenue as a result. There was a fairly straightforward financial logic, but it also had a civilizing. There was this civilizing dimension to this effort, that we, the colonial government, will make this a more productive land, a more productive people, and so it's and that logic simply continues. That we as a that if you're settled, it's easier to provide services. If you're mobile, there's something about mobility that suggests a vagabond. If pastoralists come through a village, you will often hear people say, "वो धोता नहीं है, वो गंदा है, वो चोर है, आज यहाँ पे है, कल वहाँ पे है." So if there is a theft, that person is automatically suspect. वो उसकी नियत में है कि वो चोरी तो करेगा ना, क्योंकि वो घुमंतू आदमी है. So there are tropes that have ensured that there is a deep-rooted assumption that mobility is a problem from a productivity standpoint, from a behavioral standpoint, from multiple standpoints.
Thank you, Vasant. Sanjana has a question. How can we make sure pastoralism does not get exoticized and romanticized as a livelihood, but has the benefits of modern technology and education? How can the practices of pastoralism also modernize? Do you want to take this, or should I add? Yeah.
Let me take it. It's a Sanjana, I think many of us who work on pastoralists have a romance about pastoralism. There's no two ways about it. That's partly why we love working in these landscapes. But I think there is also a hard-headed sense of why it is important for pastoralism to continue. And that's because of all the benefits that I've sort of spoken of. Also, let's recognize that that it shouldn't be a false choice, that pastoralists are making a choice from a range of options that they might have. That could include settling, it could include becoming a truck driver's helper, it could become whatever it is they wish to do. They might, but do they have the option of choosing to be a pastoralist? And that is possible if you have access to forage and veterinary care and so on. In terms of your question about how do we ensure that they have access to education or technology, they do have access to education, and many are choosing now to invest in education with the expectation that their children will manage to do something else. But as I said, households are choosing to retain a toehold in pastoralism, and they have managed to find a way by which they can accommodate both a livelihood source from animals and their children getting educated. When you think of technology, and how does one try and integrate that into pastoral systems, I don't think pastoral systems in and of themselves would improve through the use of technology. I think you need technological interventions around things like how do you process coarse wool. You need investments in a cold chain infrastructure such that pastoralists can sell milk to dairies. And it's the absence of a cold chain infrastructure that prevents them participating in the milk economy. So I don't necessarily see the need for technology to change the way pastoralism. It's a tradition. Again, I don't want to valorize tradition, but the systems have worked. They have been productive. In large parts of Europe, there is now an attempt to bring back pastoralism into the landscape. There are schools that you can go to become a pastoralist because of the acceptance, the recognition that certain lands need to be grazed. They benefit from being grazed. So I think that's my take.
Thank you, Vasant. This next one, isn't concern for preserving pastoralism still anthropocentric? Isn't it still exploiting animals? What about the good of animals? I think the question is how much of this is just a livelihood and how much of it is a human animal bond? Like, maybe if you can throw some light on that, like, is it just are animals just an instrument there for earning a living, or do their belief system, value system really
Yeah,
place?
yeah. It's a good question, and at multiple levels. One, of course, is if you look at free-ranging animals compared to animals in dairies, where there's sort of this industrial exploitation of animals. Free-ranging animals are they're happier, they're free-ranging, right? Happier is perhaps the wrong word, but it's a less stressful mode of existence. But if you look at the way in which pastoralists interact with the animals, one, a pastoralist will recognize every single animal in their herd. So if there are 400 animals, they know each one of those animals. And a herder told me the story of walking past a tea stall, and he saw an animal with another herder's herd. And he said, that was my animal, which I lost 4 years ago. And he goes up to the herder and the guy says, where did you lose it? And he tells him, I lost it in so-and-so valley. The guy says, yes, and he gave it back. So you recognize each of your animals, they're named often. Most herders will not eat their animal. They have too close a relationship. And yet, so they sell their animals. There is no other way in which pastoralism can survive. There is a market for meat. So there is no romance in our mind. There's no romance about this nature, this relationship between humans and animals, and it's sufficient in and of itself. It is transactional insofar as it is enabling a livelihood to continue, a way of life to continue. But you cannot deny the nature of the personal relationship between man and animal. It's quite spectacular to see it one-on-one.
Okay, there's a question from Deepak Dholakia who says, what are the policy changes you would suggest to save pastoralism?
Access to forage. I mean, in 3 words, access to forage. Everything else sort of takes care of itself. But that's the big one. There are other smaller issues around veterinary care and improved, investments in technology and so on. But access to forage is the.
Sina has a question. Thank you for your informative presentation. One can see glimpses of a treasure of indigenous knowledge amongst the pastoral communities. Has there been studies that elaborate more on such knowledge?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with a lot of it, but we know, for example, there's somebody in Uttarakhand, somebody called Zanskar, who's been trying to understand the ethnobotany of plants that Gujar pastoralists depend on. So in which part of the season, how do they depend, sort of medicinal benefits, treatment of animals. I suspect there's a very rich understanding of processes and plants and so on. I haven't really put my mind to that, but my sense is that there's a lot of work that has, in fact, looked at those kinds of issues.
Okay. Akash Thapa has a question. What are the effects on pastoralism of international borders? How are they affected by international borders? For example, in case of Eastern Himalayas, where northern Sikkim shares its boundaries with China and Bhutan, or Singalila National Park in Darjeeling shares its border with Nepal.
Yeah. So if you think of pastoralism in Kutch district in Gujarat, I'm more familiar with here than the northeast. Pastoralists, these are Maldhari pastoralists, used to go into Sindh till the 60s, in fact. I think even once the border was closed, they were still going into Sindh. That has completely stopped. And I think what that did was that instead of migrating westward into Sindh, they began migrating eastward into Saurashtra. And instead of a migration that was premised entirely on the seasonal use of pastures which would come to life at different parts of the year as a function of rainfall, they now began to spend the dry season in Saurashtra, where they would work with farmers. None of this used to happen in Sindh, but they were all of a sudden able to connect with farmers, graze their lands, sell their bullocks to farmers who needed bullocks to cultivate the fields. So in some ways, and this is a fascinating question insofar as it points to the necessity of pastoralists to constantly adapt to market changes, to political changes. I'm sure there were pastoralists moving from eastern Kumaon into Nepal. That has come to a close. But they have adapted to, they have had to respond to, certainly in the Changtang, in Ladakh, for example, you had pastoralists across the entire Changtang plateau into Tibet. And I suspect there was much greater movement when it was Tibet, and those borders have closed as soon as, once Tibetan occupation took place. So it's an interesting sort of sidelight on that is today the Indian Army wants pastoralists on the border because they serve to legitimize our presence over there. So there's an instrumentality in which formerly pastoralists were denied access because this is a border area, security concerns. There was suspicion of these communities. All of a sudden, we want these pastoralists up close. There's a video in which pastoralists have gotten into a fight with Chinese soldiers. And became heroes for having defended the mother. You know, I mean, it's an area that I think needs a lot of research, but complicated.
Thank you, Vasant. The last question is from Muhammad Amin Khan, who says, can you elaborate on the degradation narratives in India?
Yeah. If I could, I'm just going to go back to a slide that I was going to present. Can you see my slide, Arash? Yeah. So just as an example, one of the degradation narratives is that overgrazing in the alpine meadows leads to the influx of a species called rumex. This first picture on the top left, where you have a lot of sheep, they are standing in a bed of rumex, right? And the assumption is that rumex is going to take these places over. And it's this green flush that typifies a rumex patch, and you can see it from a distance. So if you look at the bottom left or the top right picture, you can see the red circles around this flush of rumex, right? The flush happens because these are herder camps, which are stationary. They don't move from one year to the next. And because of the heavy amounts of fertilizer, the nitrogen that animals, that exist in the animal droppings. So if you look at it up close, it looks terrible. It looks like it's completely overridden by rumex. If you pull back to the level of the landscape, it's a very small part of the landscape that has rumex. And you walk 250 meters out beyond the camp, and you're back to 40 species in 1 square meter. That is the level of diversity. It's astounding. Yeah. If you think of snow leopards, the classic argument is that pastoralists take over landscapes that should be grazed by wild ungulates. And snow leopard populations are at risk. And there's work by somebody called Shafqat Hussain in Pakistan, who has demonstrated that snow leopard densities are highest in landscapes used by pastoralists because they will every now and then take off a sheep. And so pastoral communities are subsidizing in some ways the conservation of the snow leopard, right? So you have other examples in the Great Himalayan National Park in Himachal Pradesh. Pastoralists were removed, they were forced out, and 7 or 8 years later, formerly open landscapes have now been closed. They're much more woody, they're much more thorny. So they're much less diverse from a vegetation standpoint, but they're also less usable from the standpoint of ungulates, of thar and ibex, because it's just closed over. They used to be grazed, and therefore they were open landscapes, right? So if you look at Bharatpur Wildlife Sanctuary used to be grazed by buffaloes. At some point, they decided, get rid of the buffaloes. That entire water body got clogged by a weed species, which reduced nesting space for birds. The Valley of Flowers National Park, you removed grazing, and the diversity of plant species dropped. So let's not get carried away with the fact that overgrazing cannot happen. That's not the point. The point is that it is not necessary. It is not a given. And that you would need data to establish that degradation is taking place. You would also, I think, need to be a little careful in defining what you mean by the word degradation. If you are a forester, degradation means a reduced capacity to produce trees. If you're a pastoralist, it is a reduced capacity to produce sheep. So if you have grasslands that are continuing to thrive, but they're producing sheep and not trees, then it is sustaining. It is continuing to produce a good that some parts of society value. So you define your degradation needs to be defined with regard to what has it degraded from and what is your objective over here. And if you're conservationists, if you're a forest department, then you have you have a particular view of the world. And if you're a pastoralist, it's a different view.
Vasant, thank you so much for this very enlightening presentation, and for responding to these very thought-provoking and searching questions from our participants. Thank you to our participants as well. I'm sorry we are a little over time, but I'm sure we've all enjoyed the questions and the responses of Vasant to the different questions that have been asked. Friends, the recording of this lecture will be shared online on our YouTube channel. Thank you again to everyone, especially to Vasant for putting this together, despite your very busy schedule, taking time out to do this.
Not at all.
It's been a very rewarding experience.
It's been a pleasure. It's not often that you get an audience that is willing to think about, engage with on these issues. So thank you for the opportunity, Arash, and thank you for these questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. All right, friends, till our next lecture, goodbye, and I hope we stay connected.
Thank you.
Take care.
Yeah, bye-bye.